All right, folks, glad to have you guys with us. This semester, we're kind of going to be looking at a lot of the same topics that we looked at last semester. So the theme is, I think it's what? Deep questions, real answers, something to that effect, where we're just looking at different topics and different questions that come up that sometimes Christians are hit with or sometimes stumped with and don't really know how the best response may be. And so this semester we're going to be looking at that. As Rebecca talked about Theology Thursdays, we're going to continue doing that. The first few weeks we're actually going to be doing looking at a few talks on evangelism. So if you guys have heard of Greg Koukl's book Tactics, we're going to be looking at that. And just, how do we engage people who don't think like us? Whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, it's actually a really good book to show, how do we have conversations? How do we get to truth? We're in a climate today where people are really just kind of ruled by their emotions. Both sides are ruled by their emotions. And so we want to be able to have discussions, sometimes deep thinking discussions, without so much anger and rhetoric. And sometimes when that happens, you can't really get to the meat of the discussion. And so join us for that, 11 o'clock, room 221. So tonight we're going to be looking at critical thinking, God and logic, and particularly learning how to spot logical fallacies. Now, this is not meant to be, a tool to use to try and make the person you're talking with look stupid or silly or try to humiliate them or something like that. Really what we want to do is be able to get to the truth. And so sometimes, as human beings, we all are prone to err. I'm certainly prone to error. My wife will attest to that. I knew I would get an amen from her. Basically a fallacy is an error in reasoning. And so we want to be able to think well and think rightly. So, of course, when you think of logic, most people think of Spock. So, what is logic? Well, sometimes I think a lot of times it's important to define what we mean, because I've had numerous discussions, sometimes with other campus ministers on this very campus, where they'll say things like, well, the resurrection or the virgin birth, those things are not logical. Those things are illogical, or those things are irrational. And skeptics will also take that same line of approach, as though sometimes, miracles or something can't happen because they view it as illogical. So when we're talking about logic, we're talking about a very specific science, right, that falls into philosophy. And so logic, the study of the principles of correct reasoning, it's the science that studies the formal process used in thinking and reasoning. Reasoned thought or an argument as distinguished from irrationality. So, there's a lot you could cover on this. We're just looking at a very specific target in this particular talk. But that's what I want you guys to think of. It's reasoned thought or argument as distinguished from irrationality. Now, sometimes when people hear the word argument, they immediately get the defenses up and they think it's, just yelling at each other or something like that. When we're talking about argument, we're talking about, think of like a lawyer arguing their case, right? They're giving reasons and evidence as to why they believe that their view is correct. So why should Christians study logic? My mentor, Dr. Geisler, has a really good book on this topic called, I believe it's called Let Us Reason. And in this, he says, logic deals with the methods of valid thinking. It reveals how to draw proper conclusions from premises. Logic is such an inescapable tool that even those who deny it cannot avoid using it, for it is built into the very fabric of the universe. So, as we'll learn, there's things like the law of non-contradiction, or the law of excluded middle, or the law of identity. And so, to deny things, to deny logic, is you literally have to affirm it, because you're going to be using one of those particular laws of logic. So we see Christianity is under attack a lot from skeptics. The four horsemen here, as they were called a few years back, you have Richard Dawkins, you have Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, who passed on, and then Daniel Dennett. And so these guys wrote a lot of books really targeting religious belief, and Christianity, of course, was in the crosshairs of that. And some of them are very aggressive attacks on Christianity. So Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, for example, really takes aim at the Christian faith, along with just believing in God, as the book says, as a delusion. Christopher Hitchens in his book, God is Not Great, and Sam Harris, of course. So I wanted to just kind of show you a little bit of some of what I'm referring to here. So this is at a few years back. This is at what they would call the Reason Rally, where you would have a lot of skeptics would get together and they would have almost like a big conference. And Dawkins, Richard Dawkins here is talking about, how do we engage those who hold religious beliefs?
Mock them, ridicule them. In public, don't fall for the convention that we're all too polite to talk about religion. Religion is not off the table. Religion is not off limits. Religion makes specific claims about the universe which need to be substantiated and need to be challenged and, if necessary, need to be ridiculed with contempt.
So, he's not exactly Mr. Objective there. He's saying ridicule them, mock them, etc. I agree with, part of what he's saying is that religion is not off the table, right? It is, Christianity claims certain particular events happen in history. It claims that Jesus Christ was a, human being who lived, and that he was, crucified, that he physically rose from the dead. These are claims that Christianity makes, that the universe was created. It didn't just, come out of itself from nothing, that there is design in the universe. So these are things that I think are testable. And, yeah, go ahead.
Like the Reason Rally, and like we've been to, quite a few over the years, like atheist rallies and atheist conferences and things like that. And it's completely different atmosphere than like maybe like the apologetics conference where we're like going into a workout session and learning how to say stuff. It's very, I don't want to generalize about all of them, but the main ones that we've mentioned are very much like that. It's not, they're not talking about, these objective things. It's kind of just this mocking atmosphere. I mean, in fact, there's a couple times we've been really kind of afraid to say that we were believers in those crowds because we just don't know if your car's going to get keyed or your, whatever.
Yeah, I remember Richard Dawkins spoke at Queen's University, if you remember that. And it was probably a crowd of about 500 or 600 people. And just this young little girl like Rebecca, just sweet little innocent thing, just goes up and they're doing the Q&A. And she just simply asks, Professor Dawkins, she just says, what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong? As soon as she said that, I mean, the whole place just erupted with laughter. Just dismissing her, laughing at her. Oh, the idiot. You can just hear all the comments in the back. And I would say, I would certainly hope, as Christians, if... Yeah. I mean, if we were at a conference, we would never want to do that. We care about people, and I'm not saying all atheists do that. And I've heard atheists criticize Richard Dawkins for that, and I appreciate that. I guess what I'm saying is, religion is not off the table. Christianity is one among many numerous religions. There are a lot of religions that really teach crazy things and teach bad things, and we expose those things, right? Scientology, etc. We've gone into several of those things, but you don't want to do it with contempt. You don't want to do it with trying to make people feel stupid. You want people to come to the truth, and you want it to help them be able to think, correctly. Now, on the other side of that, you have the skeptics that are, a lot of times will say things like, if you believe in miracles or that Jesus rose from the dead, you're an idiot for believing that. But, on the other hand, you have sometimes Christians and particular groups that I grew up around where it was almost the same kind of thing, that it was almost a virtue that the more unbelievable something was, the amount that, if they're the more incredible, to not have reason, to not have evidence, the more of that kind of a thing would be better than to have evidence, because, well, if you don't have evidence and you believe it, that just means your faith is that much more, right? And so Christianity isn't a logical belief to have or a religion to hold. It has nothing to do with reason or logic or thinking. And I think you guys may have not heard this before, but I remember speaking with a gentleman at church, and he was just saying he was sad to see so many of the college students go back to school because they're going to go back and they're going to get educated and they're going to learn. And I said, well, what's wrong with that? Well, when they learn and they get educated, then they walk away from Christianity. Almost implying that, well, Christianity is for stupid people, right? Now, there certainly is a type of education that certainly teaches against the possibility of miracles or the reliability of the Bible, etc. And of course, we'd say, there's not really good reasons to hold those views. But all that to say, Christians, we need to think. We need to think deeply. We should study. We need to embrace things like the laws of logic and critical thinking, because God created the universe. And as we've said numerous times, all truth is God's truth. So that is not something we should fear. Studying logic can help us think critically and correctly. Some of the greatest thinkers throughout history have been Christians. So you have people like, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. And I'll say, this is in one of the talks I do on naturalism, is, up until a lot of the new atheists arose, a lot of the academic atheist philosophers in the 60s and even, well before that, they didn't look at these arguments that St. Thomas or St. Augustine and these guys were given and just dismiss them out of hands like, they were quacks. Comparing, Thomas Aquinas's third way to, like Santa Claus or something like that. They realized they were good, rigorous arguments that had to be looked at, that had to be dealt with, that had to be thought about. And so Christianity particularly has a very good history of good thinkers. So let's talk a little bit about an argument. What is an argument? Well, an argument is any group of propositions or a statement that which is true or false, of which one is claimed to follow logically from the others. So again, I want you guys to get your mind out of this idea of argument as what you see on the news with politics, and rather in a philosophical sense, this is what an argument is. A premise would be a proposition that gives reasons, grounds, or evidence for accepting some other proposition called the conclusion. And a conclusion, of course, is a proposition which is purported to be established on the basis of other propositions. So when we're looking at arguments, it's almost like, they're building and framing a house. You have the solid foundation, you have the walls, you have the roof, right? And so sometimes you'll hear things, again, kind of going back to that one particular discussion that I had with a fellow minister who was claiming that the virgin birth was ridiculous, right? And I said, well, why is it ridiculous? Well, it's just illogical. Well, why is it illogical? Well, it's just ridiculous. See, I was trying to press her, well, what is the argument against miracles? Do you have reasons? Do you have arguments? Or is it just, oh, that's just silly? See, mocking is not an argument. Mockery is not an argument. And so, when we have those type of encounters, it's good to be able to press them and ask, what are the reasons for this? And it's the same with us, right? As we're sharing the gospel and we're having these type of conversations, people will ask us, well, why should I think that the Bible is true? Why should I think Jesus loves me and wants to forgive me of my sin, right? Well, this is where apologetics can come in and help us, and we can form and build arguments as to why we think God exists, why we think the Bible is true, why we think Jesus rose from the dead. So arguments, it's not a bad thing. These are good things. These are tools. You know, as an apologist, think of yourself almost like a craftsman, right? Or a handyman, right? You have your belt and you have your different tools in the belt, and depending on the job is going to depend upon the tool, right? So if I'm discussing with an atheist who doesn't believe God exists, I'm going to have to start in a different place than, for example, with a Muslim or a Mormon who, you know, particularly the Mormon or the Muslim who is monotheist. I don't need to necessarily start with, you know, proving the existence of God, right? So think of it like that. You know, you have your tool belt on, and depending on who you're going to talk to is going to depend upon the tool that you're going to use. But arguments are something that, like the ruler, you know, for the carpenter, you're going to need it all the time. Yeah.
Sometimes we think about things like, you know, the word of the peacemaker. Many times we think that that's an odds of giving arguments, having a debate. You know, it's supposed to go back and forth. The Christians kind of develop the attitude that, oh, well, to keep peace, I'm going to, you know, let them just believe what they believe. Let them, even if it's bad, you know, for their soul, ultimately, or if they're teaching bad things, you know. I'm just going to let them teach, just, I'm not going to, for the sake of peace, I'm not going to address it or bring it up or do a dialogue about it. And that's not the idea of, you know, biblically what a peacemaker is. You know, a peacemaker, obviously, you're not arguing just to argue. You're arguing with a purpose in mind. And the truth ultimately is what gives us true peace, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
And I think being able to give good arguments and have good discussion with people can ultimately help provide giving us ground to have peace, right? To have some agreement. Maybe, it may not, you know, it may be one of those things where you don't agree at all. But, you know, at least, you know, the position at least is understood. And a lot of times it's just correcting maybe a misunderstanding, you know. Next week we're going to have Clinton Wilcox. He's going to be here. And he is a pro-life missionary with Life Training Institute. And he's going to give a philosophical and logical defense of the pro-life position. So, you know, you want to talk about a view that's often misunderstood and, you know, just kind of demonized. That's it. So, you know, next week we'll kind of see a lot of this in action in the real world as well. So a logical fallacy, let's talk about this. So a fallacy is a mistaken reasoning. In the study of logic, there are two basic categories of logical fallacy. The formal, which deals with the form of the argument, and informal, which deals with examining the content of the argument. So tonight we're going to be looking at the second, the informal. So we'll be looking at some of the content of the argument. So, you know, if you get any logic textbook or critical thinking textbook, it'll have, you know, these chapters on informal fallacies and how they are divided up. So you have fallacies of relevance, fallacies of weak induction, and fallacies of presumption. So fallacies of relevance, and if you guys have questions, feel free to shoot up your hand at any time. Fallacies of relevance are attempts to prove a conclusion by offering considerations that simply don't bear on its truth. In order to prove that a conclusion is true, one must offer evidence that supports it. Arguments that commit fallacies of relevance don't do this. The consideration that they offer in support of their conclusions are irrelevant to determining the truth, or to determining whether that conclusion is true. So let's look at some of these examples of fallacies of relevance. Ad hominem, this is personal attacks. A lot of these are in Latin. Arguments of this kind focus not on the evidence for a view, but on the character of the person advancing it. They seek to discredit positions by discrediting those who hold them. It is always important to attack arguments rather than arguers. And this is where arguments that commit the ad hominem fallacy fall down. So I've been doing enough talking, I think. I want you guys to do some talking. Give me some examples that you could think of that may fall into this category of a ad hominem.
What do you cried wolf? Last time because he was a liar.
The boy who cried wolf, okay. Wasn't expecting the fairy tale, but okay, that'll work. What about today? What in maybe some examples that maybe you guys see today or deal with? What would be another example? I think that's right. I think you're right, Christian, on that. Any others? Yeah, see that a lot in politics, right? Any others? Yes?
I think a common thing, like with literature studies or you talk about philosophy, a lot of times people will look at what this philosopher did or a writer did, and then discredit what they wrote or what they developed and believed, because like a popular one is like they got slaves or they like mistreated women, because most of the time it's men who wrote things if you're looking at classical stuff.
That's good.
Or they did something bad, or you know,
Right.
and then they use that to say, well, we can't look at anything that this person said or did, which
Right.
doesn't always work out well if you're trying to do anything.
I think that's brilliant. You're absolutely right. And because when you think about it, we all do things we shouldn't do, right? Some of our secrets are just more hidden than others, but it doesn't follow that everything we say from that is false, right? You've had in the past Christians, and you'll have in the future, high-profile Christians that preach certain things and say certain things, and it comes out their life didn't match their doctrine. And this is awful when this happens, and it hurts, but it doesn't disprove Christianity, does it? It doesn't mean that the Bible's false because this particular person fails to live to the standards of the Bible or the teachings of Christ. It just means, that person wasn't what they were portraying to be. Go ahead.
That'd be like saying, you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you need to go on a diet, for your health, and here's the science about how to, be healthy, and you look at him and you go, well, you're overweight, so that's total bunk, right?
Pastor Ware was at my last doctor visit, he heard.
Right? I mean, that
right.
Yeah. Just because the doctor doesn't necessarily follow his own advice,
right,
doesn't mean that the doctor's actual advice is wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
So sometimes with this one, it's hard for even me to get over sometimes if the person did do bad things. Even though it's not really connected to just facts that they're talking about or ideas, it still makes you say do I really I don't really feel like listening to this person.
I think that's right, yeah. They are discredited. The message is not, though, right? I may not want to hear this person anymore because X, Y, and Z, but that doesn't mean I don't want to hear the gospel anymore just because this person, did what they did. One example may also be you hear this kind of thing you are just a Christian because, it makes you feel better, right? The psychological analysis. You can't live your life, knowing that at the end of the day, there's nothing there, right? That when you die, you just go to the ground. And that's the only reason you really believe in God. It's just because it makes you feel better, not because of the evidence. Well, and there are people, maybe that's the case, but even if that was the case, that wouldn't mean Christianity is false, right? Even if the person didn't have good reasons to believe it. So we want to be careful. We want to be careful with personal attack. We don't want to assign motives to the two people. We don't want to do the psychological analysis. We don't know the heart. We don't know the reasons why. We just want to be able to look at the position. And so personal attack is not something we want to engage in. Here's an example of this. William Dembski was one of the founders of the modern intelligent design movement. So Dembski argues that modern biology supports the idea that there is an intelligent designer who created life. Dembski is only saying this because he's religious. Like, you hear this all the time. There's a popular clip with Stephen Meyer and Dan Abrams that was several years back. It was just brutal to watch, the attack that Meyer went under. And it was basically just kept pounding. It's all religion. It's just only religious. And then, they conclude, therefore, modern biology doesn't support intelligent design. Of course, with 2, what's the issue there? Why does 3 not follow from 2? Yes, go ahead. Right. You were going to say something?
It's irrelevant to whether biology is incorrect.
Right. Yeah, it's just completely irrelevant. So maybe he is religious, maybe he's not. What does that have to do with what do the arguments show, right? Go ahead, Christian.
If it was true that this is the only reason to believe that, sure, we wouldn't have good reason to believe it. That's not a good reason. But we can find bad reasons to believe anything. The matters is whether or not they're good ones.
Yeah, that's right. You were going to say?
I hear this all the time when people say, well, we can't trust what the authors of the New Testament had to say because, after all, they were believers. And so, we have to look at some other evidence from some other source. Well, it totally eliminates the possibility that they were believers because
it's true.
The evidence.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's right. Yep.
That they wrote about it because they cared about it because there was evidence for it. You can't just exclude somebody because.
Yeah, it'd be like saying that with the Holocaust, that the survivors only believed it. They were already biased towards it. Well, maybe because they went through it, right? And they saw it. So personal attacks. Notice this, guys. Personal attacks always take the focus off the argument being offered and instead focus on the person giving the argument. So when you see this, a lot of times they just don't have a response. They don't have substance. And so they just attack the person rather than the argument. So it's always best to just, let them say what they want. I'm a disgusting, terrible, awful, rotten, stupid human being. I'm an idiot. I'll grant you that. Now deal with the argument. How does that refute the particular argument, right? Red herring is another one. So the red herring is as much a debate tactic as it is a logical fallacy. It is a fallacy of distraction and is committed when a listener attempts to divert an arguer from his argument by introducing another topic. This can be one of the most frustrating and effective fallacies to observe. So what's an example of a red herring that you guys might be able to think of? Yeah, it was something like they would use these red herring. There was like a bad smelling fish, and they would put the people that were trying to get away would put it on the trails or something to throw the bloodhounds off of the scent, I think. And so that's kind of why they use that name. But what's an example? Where would we may see something like a red herring?
What about the Crusades?
What about the Crusades? Yeah. Yeah, okay. What about the Crusades? That's a good one. Any others?
I guess it could be like anything where you're talking about, like, say you're trying to talk about just specifically about whether or not something logically makes sense, and then they'll introduce, or they'll try to, like, go away from it by talking about whether or not it's morally right, or like whether or not, like how it makes them feel emotionally or something like that, to try to make that equate to like the argument you're already trying to make, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's good. Next week, you guys will see as Clinton's up here, I want you guys to remember these. In fact, maybe Melissa, we can send out a list of logical fallacies, and because this one's used all the time in the abortion debate, as we'll see. But let's see, example. So Christian kind of hit on this a little bit there with the same kind of analogy there, but. So Bill says, there are good reasons to think that God exists from found breakthroughs in science. And Karen responds, well, everybody knows the Bible's full of contradictions. Well, the issue is, first of all, does God exist, right? Is there evidence from science? And just kind of bringing up other issues, you kind of want to go one thing at a time. And so if you're giving reasons, if somebody's asking, and me and Melissa have had this happen a lot, at convocation or when we're tabling, etc., and somebody's asking, well, what reasons is there to think God exists? And you start to give some of the arguments, and then they jump into slavery and ethics and, all these other issues, and it's like you can't deal with everything at once. Like, go one at a time, and then, kind of work your way through it. You can get to whether the Bible is full of contradictions, but what I notice sometimes is with skeptics, they ask a question, and before you can even give the response, they're already on to the next objection. Like, if we're really looking for truth and wanting to find out what is true, we have to be willing to delve in a little bit and see and listen to the answer before we're moving on to the next objection. And, that goes for us as well, as Christians, right? As we're dialoguing with other people that may not have the same views as us, make sure we're able to listen, and we're not committing these particular fallacies ourselves, because it's easy for us to do that.
I want to see a boatload of red herrings. Check out the debate Devin had.
Oh, yeah.
Not too long ago, what was it, a year and a half ago?
Yep.
Here on campus.
Yep, that's right.
That video should be on there.
Yeah, it is. It's on our YouTube channel.
Not Devin with the red hair. It was his debate. The guy debating him.
That's good to clear up there.
So I should be clear about that.
Yeah. Bill says there's very good historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And then it's, Simon might say, well, there's more mosques being built right now than there are churches. We've had a lot of, interactions with Jehovah's Witnesses, and they will say this kind of thing all the time. Well, look at all the the churches, or what do they call the Kingdom Halls being put up, and I remember the one particular guy, Mr. Paul, he came over for a long time, and that was always what they would point to, the work around, the world, and how many Bibles and how many books. And he was so proud of that. And that's fine and dandy, but that has nothing to do with whether or not it's true and whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. So watch out for that red herring. Another one is the genetic fallacy. Genetic fallacy is committed when an idea is either accepted or rejected because of its source rather than its merit. Scarlett kind of hit on this a little bit with her referring to the literature. So here's an example. This sometimes comes from Christians. The Kalam cosmological argument was formulated by a Muslim, therefore Christians should not use it. I've heard this more than once. What would you guys say to that? What would the response be to that, would you guys say? So remember, the Kalam is whatever begins to exist as a cause, universe began to exist, therefore the universe is a cause. It was a Muslim philosopher that discovered and formulated that argument. I'll say, well, Muslims use it, therefore Christians shouldn't. Go ahead. Say that one more time, I'm sorry.
Non-Christians, if that's true, then non-Christians shouldn't use Newton's laws.
Yeah, okay.
Christians, therefore, disqualifies.
Yeah, that's good. Yep. Yeah, so I mean, it really is irrelevant, right? We wouldn't, like you're saying with science, you wouldn't say, well, particular laws of physics or gravity or whatever, it's discovered, certain math stuff we shouldn't use if it wasn't formulated by a Christian. It's not how it works, right? God has created the universe. Within the universe, you have reality and all these particular things that help govern and work in reality. And so that a Muslim or whoever comes and is able to formulate the argument, the question is whether it's true or not, right? And that's what we want to examine. And I've heard this a lot actually from people within the Christian camp. They'll say, basically, the Kalam and these other classical arguments for God's existence, the teleological, the cosmological, the moral argument, all this does is just kind of point to, Aristotle's God. It doesn't show the God of the Bible. Well, why do we have to assume that one argument has to provide everything, right? It doesn't. You're building the case. It's not, the Kalam cosmological argument alone does not prove Trinitarianism, but it's not less than monotheism either, right? You have to add to it, right? Who says you have to prove everything in one argument? You can build a cumulative case. And so genetic argument fails because even from bad things, good may come. We therefore ought not to reject an idea just because of where it comes from. We must test the actual arguments to see if they are sound, regardless of who says them. Right? So it doesn't matter who says it. The issue is what they're saying true or not? And again, as Christians, we have to be willing to do the same thing. Many Muslims, for example, say that the resurrection is just a borrowed story from the Greek mythology that Christians adopted and stole from neighboring religions. You hear this is probably before you guys were ever really into it, but what was that famous documentary with Bill? Zeitgeist, yep. Had a whole section on that, how Christianity was just ripped off from these other particular pagan gods. That's irrelevant. The issue is the arguments that are given to defend the resurrection and the historicity of Jesus, do they work or don't they? Are they false or not? We've given several talks on like the minimal facts argument. If you go to our YouTube channel, Ratio Christie went through YouTube, you can see several lectures we've given on the minimal facts argument. They have to be looked at. You can't just dismiss it by saying, oh, that's just borrowed from pagan religions.
And to be fair, there are arguments obviously against that, historically by the Hobart myths and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah. Ronald Nash wrote a really good book called The Gospel in the Greeks. It just shows, the vast majority of atheists, distance themselves from that Zeitgeist film because it was ridiculous. Appeal to authority. So this, what time do we have, Pastor Ware?
We got 15 minutes.
Okay. Appeal to authority. This informal fallacy occurs only when the authority cited is either not an authority or B, is not an authority on the subject on which he's being cited. If someone either isn't an authority at all or isn't an authority on the subject which they're speaking, then that undermines the value of their testimony. So, for example, if I'm having a discussion about astronomy, and say me and Pastor Ware having a discussion about astronomy, and he cites some astronomer, and to bolster his point, and I say, well, that's just an appeal to authority. That's a fallacy. It's not a fallacy, right? It would only be a fallacy if the person he's citing is a doctorate in biology, for example, right? If he has a degree, or if he is an expert in that particular field, then it's not a fallacy to appeal to somebody in that particular field. Now, as we'll see, what happens is a lot of times people will appeal to those who, because they have a doctorate in something, therefore they're an expert in all things. As we'll see, they're not. So just kind of an example dialogue. The skeptic Bill says, I should say Muslim, Imam has a PhD and he says the New Testament is not reliable. Well, what is your professor's degree in? It's in biology. So you'll hear people oftentimes cite Richard Dawkins, for example, because he goes on a diatribe in his books, The God Delusion, about why the Bible isn't reliable, etc. That doesn't mean what he's saying is false. That's not what I'm saying at all. Maybe what he's saying is true. You have to look at it, right? But my point is, when they're appealing to him and saying, well, he has a PhD, and he has a doctorate from Oxford, and he's saying that the Bible has all these problems, well, his doctorate isn't in the New Testament or in the Bible. His doctorate's in biology.
Or even in history.
Yeah, or history. Yeah, and as you'll see, several philosophers, even atheist philosophers, who reviewed that book, his book, The God Delusion, gave it a scathing review. And it's very clear, look, this book is more about theology than it is biology or anything like that. So, just because a person has a particular degree in one field doesn't make them an expert in another. And I've seen really smart men. You see, Richard Dawkins is a very brilliant man. He has a doctorate. He is, he knows his field. But when he gets into things like theology, you will see him make just basic, elementary errors that the Sunday school kid knows how to refute. And it's because he's just not knowledgeable on that topic. And so we want to be careful as well. We don't want to fall into that fallacy either. You guys understand kind of what I'm saying here with the appeal to authority? So if you're an expert or if somebody's appealing to an expert in that field, that's not a fallacy. Let me hit that real quick. Many of the so-called new atheists will often cite works of people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Lawrence Krauss is another one that's really popular right now, Carl Sagan, of course, as authorities on whether there's evidence for the existence of God. The problem with this question, again, whether God exists, it's a philosophical category, right? Not a scientific one. And so it really is an issue that, is going to be appealed to by a lot of the philosophers. That's not to say you can't critique scientific arguments that theists may put out, the argument from design or fine-tuning, etc. Those are things that, that's up for the scientists to look at and discover. But kind of the question itself as to whether does God exist is really a philosophical issue, not a scientific issue. One of the reviews, Alvin Planting is one of the top philosophers of the day, philosopher at Notre Dame. He says, the God Delusion, however, contains little science. It is mainly philosophy and theology, or perhaps atheology would be a better term, and evolutionary psychology, along with a substantial dash of social commentary decrying religion and its allegedly baneful effects. He goes on to say, he might say some of his forays into philosophy are best sophomoric, but that would be unfair to sophomores. I mean, a lot of his colleagues really, the philosophers really criticize that book fairly heavily. So we'll go on. This particular fallacy, appeal to pity. This type of argument is fallacious because our emotional responses are not always a good guide to truth. Emotions can cloud rather than clarify issues. We should base our beliefs upon reason rather than on emotion if we want our beliefs to be true. Anybody have any examples of the appeal to pity? Yeah.
I think it's often happens that people are resistant to even looking at or evaluating arguments for something if that something is something that makes them feel bad.
Oh.
something that they don't want to hear or want to acknowledge, and so their bad feelings prevent them from actually considering the evidence.
Yeah.
I see. Go ahead.
I was gonna say like a common, like what this makes me think of that like everybody experiences in everyday life is like if you get in an argument with someone like in your family or like one of your friends, if you're not like, usually what makes this argument explode is you're focused on how you feel rather than like what actually went wrong and talking about that. So you don't get past the thing that caused you to get angry. You're just focused on how
Right.
you feel.
Yeah. We can all fall into that, don't we? And we do all fall into that. Yes.
This is what we especially need to be careful of with any argument about what's moral. Because what we don't want to do is look at something and say, oh, it makes you feel bad, it's immoral. It's easy to do that sometimes.
Yeah, explain that a little more, Christian.
Well, a lot of times we'll base our ideas about what's right or wrong based on how, like, oh, this makes you feel bad. Like, oh, I don't like this.
Right.
That must be a bad thing, right? It isn't necessarily the case. Sometimes painful things aren't moral at all. Like, not saying immoral, but like immoral.
Right.
And sometimes you need to do things that are painful.
That's true. Very good. Yes, sir.
I mean, this one is, probably a little personal with women. Someone may say, like, let's say you're talking about sexual orientation, for instance, and someone says, well, one person says, well, I don't believe that, same-sex relationships are moral, someone says, oh, they're okay. Person says they're okay, says, well, I have a child or a daughter or son or someone that I love, my brother's gay, and so that's kind of, I mean,
Right.
that relationship within the family, that appeals to that, can be pretty much their argument,
Yeah.
that kind of, that's how they're wanting to, or they could say something like, well, I had a brother who was gay and he was bullied and took his life or something like that, which could have really happened, and something that we should be compassionate about, obviously. It doesn't still affirm, whether or not that position is, or that act is moral or not. Though.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think as Christians, we just have to really be aware of that, and even with our own selves, that we're not the standards. Our feelings are not the standards, and our family members, unfortunately, are not the standard. Where we've seen it, where you have people that were sound, and then suddenly their daughter or something or son comes out and has these type of struggles, and they're ready to abandon the Bible because of it. Don't do that.
I've seen Christians do this too. They're resistant to even doing anything in the realm of apologetics because they don't want to think about their faith, because after all, maybe somebody that they love, that was close to them, died.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't even want to consider the possibility that Christianity is not true, because if Christianity is not true, then I won't see my loved one again, right? So,
Yeah.
we, again, like you said, we have to be aware of that too, and not just,
And on the flip side, those who may hold more liberal theology would not want, they hold this more of, as long as you believe in something, everybody goes to heaven, and not want to dive into more of what the biblical principles are, because if they do, then, well, what does that mean for my loved one who died lost, right? Yeah. So that's good. Yeah, so I mean, that's issues we have to deal with. What? Okay. So, for example, Tina doesn't get an abortion, then she will have to quit school. Well, the issue is whether or not abortion is unjustly taking the innocent life, regardless of the personal consequences that may follow. We'll dive more into that next week. But, as you'll see next week, these are fallacies that come all the time to cloud the issue on this issue of abortion. But
And it was this opportunity, like I said, to be compassionate. It was this opportunity, people talk about their personal experiences or, those situations that are difficult in their lives. Sometimes them.
Yeah.
And to show them you care, but it doesn't. You can have truth without compromise.
Yeah.
Have convictions about things and still care about people. And I think within our culture, definitely the church has lost that sense of that. But people know the difference when you're in convictions and you care about them.
Yeah. And I think that's the important thing. You know, we want to be able to speak truth, be beacons of truth, can't compromise on truth, but we don't want to be nasty. We don't want to, you know, turn people against the faith by our demeanor and our attitude and the way we interact. You know, the truth itself is offensive enough. You know, we don't need to add to that. Our goal is to walk with people. So I'll go ahead and end here, but any thoughts or anything on this particular thing tonight? I hope, you know, this will encourage you guys to, you know, keep thinking deeply about these issues. Study the issue of critical thinking and the fallacies. They're good to know what they are. And use it to have, you know, conversations. The good thing about this is you can have them with Christians and non-Christians to try and discover truth and come to that which is true, but do it in a way that's not, you know, brings more light than it does heat.
You can have in your marital relationships too.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. Appeal to emotion. Pastor Ware, I will let you go ahead and close us in prayer. You can go ahead and turn the video off. Next week, again, Clinton will be here, and we'll be doing a kind of a pro-life 101. So